Hey, you said that, not me.
You mentioned talking to Taliban. Do you think that's a good idea at all, considering that that is the group that the US was trying to defeat 18 years back?
I do think that I think we need to take a step back for a second and think about what exactly was the war in Afghanistan for. And I'm going to try to avoid being at all controversial here, and I'm going to say that what I think the war was for at its core was to remove from power individuals who had enabled Osama bin Laden. If we take that as the purpose of the war, I think that we have sent a sufficiently strong signal through our investment of blood and treasure in this war to suggest that we never again will allow an incumbent regime to promote an actor like that, to safeguard an actor like that, without them needing to constantly look over their shoulders. I think that message has been sent. And, one needs to recognize also that if it is the will of the Afghan people that the Taliban be a political player, and I think that, frankly, it is, they should be allowed to have a seat at the table. And of course, this, for me is a very difficult thing. This is our blood. This is our treasure. I've had, my brother-in-law has been there fighting. I have friends that have been lost there. In principle, we're all at least indirectly connected to some individual who was directly affected by that war. And it's hard to say that we've accomplished what was intended, and yet the actor that was removed from power be at the negotiating table. I can understand why that might seem like a contradiction in terms. But at the same time, I think one needs to recognize political reality. And the political reality is that this is an incredibly powerful, not terribly unpopular political organization inside of Afghanistan. And that if we are ever to build a government or be part of the government, assist the government in forming, that has a possibility of surviving with a U.S. withdrawal, it must involve the Taliban in some capacity. And one would hope that the deal that's negotiated would be one such that it looks like we have a return on our investment, that the government has the upper hand in the negotiation. But when the leader of that country is willing to claim to withdraw with a tweet, it dramatically undermines the bargaining position of that incumbent party, of all of the individual negotiators that are part of that deal. And, I think that sort of, to me, that's a far larger trivialization of the lives that have been lost and the incredible economic resources that have been expended into that country. Simply claiming that one would leave at the drop of a hat does more violence to the idea that we've lost people and treasure there than claiming that the solution path forward is to find a peace deal with the very actors that we remove from power.
There's lots more to talk about, but given the lack of time, we can't do all of it. I would particularly urge our listeners to look at your paper on IEDs and how they have retained their effectiveness despite the investment by coalition forces, and also your paper linking rugged terrain to civil wars. I would like to end with a broad question. I started with a broad question, and I would want to end with one, which is that when people, especially those who are not very scientifically proficient, when they look at your studies, they've been done on some very micro level data and they ask some very peculiar questions. And some would question the point of your work. Like some would question, why do you go about finding, for example, the impact of rugged terrains on civil wars, or how IEDs have been equally effective in the past 15 years? How do you respond to those critics?
So I will say that I could understand why one might be confused about why we need to study the role of terrain ruggedness and sort of long-run consequences for violence. I think that anyone that questions why one should study whether or not the Taliban or any rebel organization are capable of dynamically learning and adjusting to billions of dollars of U.S. counter-IED investments, that I would sort of say, perhaps you need to reevaluate your priorities if you think that kind of research is trivial. But no, I can't, there are some questions that we are actively engaged in that, at least at face value, do not appear to yield actionable insights, right? So I'll give you a brief example. We have a paper on rebel tactics in Afghanistan. And one of the things that we're interested in studying is the sort of long-run theories of counterinsurgency that seem to suggest that rebel groups that are relatively weak engage, their relative advantage is engaging in unpredictable attacks. And if indeed that's true, then we would anticipate that relatively weak organizations would conduct as if random timing attacks. As they get stronger, they can identify vulnerabilities in their enemies' fortifications, and they can engage in attacks that reflect those vulnerabilities. And if, for example, they've found time windows when they're vulnerable, their attacks are not going to look random anymore. They're going to look temporally clustered. And so what we do in one of these papers is we investigate the link between revenue shocks from the opium trade and temporal randomness of attacks. And we were once asked, like, well, can you tell me exactly when they're going to carry out an attack? And the answer is no, we can't tell you exactly when a particular facility is vulnerable. But what we can tell you is that if there is a vulnerability, the relatively stronger organization is going to be capable of identifying it. And in the long run, like, that particular outcome might not be the outcome that shapes policy, but what it suggests is it produces empirical implications of something much more important about the nature of insurgency in Afghanistan, which is that they're capable of converting capital inputs, revenue inputs, into meaningful tactical adjustments in the battlefield. The relationship between revenue and those combat operations is a function of their ability to spy on the coalition. And we can then sort of test all sorts of other consequences. Like, for example, this is one form of a positive revenue shock. What happens if we could shock that same organization with battlefield losses, which is going to constrain their labor inputs? And indeed, we see the opposite effect. That as you have relatively more of these labor shocks, it reduces your randomness because you can't actually engage in those kind of targeted strikes. And so I think at the end of the day, right, some of these papers, the core topic might seem like an academic luxury, but at the end of all of it, we hope that we walk away with a better understanding of the industrial organization of rebellion, and that helps us shape policy in a meaningful way.
Indeed. Thank you, Professor Wright. This has been a great chat. I think we've already exceeded the time limit by about 10 minutes. I learned a lot, especially about border walls and your work on Afghanistan, and I hope this is beneficial to our listeners as well. Thank you again.
Yeah, thank you.
This episode of UC3P was produced by Prabhat Singh, engineered by Haz Yano, and edited with help from me, Susan Paykin. Thank you again to Professor Austin Wright for sitting down with us for this week's episode. Don't forget to like or rate this episode on iTunes, and check us out on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at the UC3P. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Hey UC3P listeners, I'm Thomas.
And I'm Nick.
In the United States, public faith in the military remains sky high, while trust in other government institutions sinks to an all-time low.
At the same time, fewer than 1% of Americans will ever serve in the armed forces, and the cultural divide between active duty troops and the civilian population continues to widen.
UC3P presents a new series, Thank You for Your Service, where we take a deep dive into the complex world of civil-military affairs.
We'll address the politicization of the military, defense policy in the news, and the importance of staying informed in a democracy.
Join us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts as we explore how our professional military institution relates to the society it serves.